Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to EUFIC Symposium on Processed Foods. Let me start by thanking you all for joining us. Your interest is hugely appreciated, especially in these days of Zoom fatigue. And when I say you all, I refer to more than 1,000 registered attendees from across the globe, and to be precise, 1,117 until a few minutes ago. I'm delighted to say that people from all continents have registered for the symposium, from all populated continents, from Norway over North Macedonia to South Africa, and from Mexico over Saudi Arabia to Singapore, and from across sectors. About 1/4 of you come from academia, another quarter is made of health professionals and educators, about 40% of registered attendees are from food and drink industries, and about 10% are interested citizens, policymakers, and media professionals. I hope that you will enjoy it. My name is Milka Sokolović. I'm head of Food and Health Science Department in EUFIC, the European Food Information Council, and it is my pleasure to be your host in the coming hour and a quarter. Let me shortly tell you what this symposium is all about. The evidence for the first use of fire as a tool for landscaping, hunting, and cooking dates back to 400,000 years ago. Since then, over the agricultural revolution and to the current day, processed food has always been with us, but it has never been so broadly used, so innovatively developed, so thoroughly scientifically scrutinized, and so hotly disputed as it is today. Evidence of high interest in processed food is all around us, for instance, in the frequency of the topic hitting the headlines and in the ripples that it creates in social media. But the question is why, and why now? It has been a good century since nutrition science has made its first steps and described the first vitamins. By now, we have learned a lot about the relationship between food and health. Based on direct human intervention studies, we know about associations between nutrient intakes and either risk factors for chronic diseases or chronic diseases as such. Examples of those associations include dietary lipids and cardiovascular diseases, sodium, potassium, and hypertension, carotenoids and age-related macular degeneration, folic acid and neural tube defect, calcium, vitamin D, and osteoporosis, and the list is by no means exhaustive. But we also know that nutrients are not consumed in isolation. They are consumed as foods and meals as part of our dietary patterns. And our dietary patterns and lifestyle have changed dramatically in the last half century, leaving us with a challenge of triple burden of malnutrition pressing the globe. At the same time, and especially during the last decade, views have been expressed that challenge the position of nutrition science, like this one of Carlos Monteiro, one of the authors of the NOVA food classification. The most important factor now, says Monteiro, when considering food, nutrition, and public health, is not nutrients and it's not foods so much as what is done to foodstuffs. That is to say, the issue is food processing and what happens to food and to us as a result of processing. In the last several years, the randomized controlled trials have linked ultra-processed foods with increased calorie intake and eating rate, and thereby with weight gain. I'm, for instance, referring to the work of Kevin Hall from last year and the work of Kees de Graaf and colleagues published in Appetite. There is also a number of epidemiological studies that reported associations between processed food intake and, among others, obesity, heart disease, depression and frailty in older adults, high blood pressure, irritable bowel syndrome, and some cancers. And these studies include, for instance, the work of Mathilde Touvier and colleagues. The causal mechanisms behind these associations are still to be detangled, but the stir has been created and the discussion has reached the general public. And this happens at the moment when scientists are still searching for a consensus on even the basic issues like definitions and classification, risks and benefits, concepts and values associated with processed food, as is currently being reviewed by the University of Surrey. I wonder if you remember this question from our registration page. This word cloud, created from your associations with a term and showing the top 60 words by frequency, is a nice illustration of the complexity of this issue. So with that backdrop of complexity, we are here today to broaden our joint understanding of what we do and do not know about processed foods and how to talk about it. So today our 4 experts will share their thoughts and views from the perspectives of concepts and definitions, epidemiology, psychobiology, food safety and processed foods. It is a great pleasure to introduce the speakers. I have decided to let their talks speak about the researchers they are. Instead, I would like to offer you a tiny glimpse into the humans they are. So in order of appearance, Christina Sedler is Senior Manager at the Department of Food and Health Science in EUFIC and postgraduate researcher at the University of Surrey. She was born in England, raised in Scotland, works in Belgium, studies in the UK, and today she's giving her presentation from Italy. With 9 half marathons under her belt, she's a keen runner, cycler, and ice skater, and will try any adventure sport once. She also has her whole heart in whole grain, and just check her tweets for that proof. Dr. Mathilde Touvier is the director of the Nutritional Epidemiology Research Team and the research director at INSERM in France. She loves modern dancing and playing the violin, not at the same time though. And her biggest challenge currently is not how to marry her 2 passions, science and art. It is rather how to make her husband and teenage kids eat fruits and veggies, but not only tomatoes and bananas. Kees de Graaf is Professor of Sensory Science and Eating Behavior at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Quite exceptionally for the world of science, I would say, Kees was trained as a nutritionist, did his PhD on sweetness perception, and is still working on this topic, all in Wageningen. He loves mountain hiking and mountain biking in the Netherlands, of all mountainous places on this planet. And he has just found his new passion in singing, so stay tuned. Andrea Rajković is professor in microbial food safety at Ghent University in Belgium. He was named after Andrei Nikolaevich Bolkonsky from Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, and after his great-grandfather. He goes in life by certain principles, one of them being elephantus non capit murem. And although he is a multifaceted food scientist, he finds his deepest personal interest in fasting. And in case you ever wondered, Christina and Andrea are both Christmas babies. Now, before inviting them to share their work and views with you, let's please establish a few housekeeping rules. Except for the speakers, all cameras and microphones will be off to allow for better connection and better focus. May you have any questions, and they are all very welcome. Please ask them using the Q&A tab, which you will find here at the bottom of your screen. The questions will be answered orally during the Q&A session, and we will go as far as the time allows. We acknowledge that 20 minutes of Q&A session is not much, so please help us be more efficient by asking clear questions, by addressing them to a specific speaker, and by upvoting the questions asked by others that you would appreciate being answered. You can use the chat box to ask any technical questions or leave comments. We would also like to invite you to share your impressions on social media. Please use the hashtag #TalkProcessedFoods to allow us to create and follow the same discussion. And let's show that those ripples do not only get created by media headlines. After the symposium, you will receive the recording and the PDFs of the presentations. And in return, we would like to kindly ask you to share your feedback in the survey. It would take not more than 3 minutes, and it will greatly help us to improve. So without further ado, Christina, please, The screen is yours.
Thank you, Milka. So I will start by saying that the topic of processed food is one that creates a lot of confusion and debate, both among consumers and scientists. There's a lot of conflicting information about processed foods. And because it's such a complex topic and one where we don't have a consensus, it's also very challenging for us as EUFIC to communicate about processed foods. And this is why I'm doing a PhD research project on understanding perceptions of processed foods. And as part of this research, I've been looking at the definitions and classification of processed foods. And I'm able to share with you some of the learnings today. So if we start by asking what are processed foods? Well, this is a very good question, and it's not one that's easy to answer. There's not one clear definition of processed food. It's an ambiguous term, and it can mean different things to different people. If we look at the term food processing, we can understand that to mean any method used to turn fresh foods into food products. It includes various different food processing methods, ranging from simple things like washing of food, cutting, cooking, and other methods such as pasteurization, fermentation, drying, packaging, milling, the list goes on. So we can understand that almost all the foods we eat today are processed in some way. And that's why there's been a development of classification systems that seek to categorize different types of processed food. And you can see on the slide, there are different classification systems. These are mostly developed to study the relationship between processed food and nutrition and our health. We looked at the underlying basis of these classification systems, and we found that the definitions and the criteria used to categorize the foods vary. There's no consensus on what determines the level of food processing. They may consider different factors, including the extent of change of a food from its natural state, including, for example, is the food matrix or the food structure of the original food intact or disrupted? The nature of change may also include adding ingredients like fat, sugar, salt, and additives. Some of the classification systems also explicitly refer to the purpose of processing. So, for example, are additives used for the function of food safety or for other reasons like taste? Place of processing is relevant because many of the classification systems only categorize industrial processing, so processing done by the food industry. However, several processing techniques are also done by us in our home kitchens. There is some overlap between food processing and convenience level. Often highly processed foods are described as ready-made or ready-to-eat foods, and the definitions in these classifications may also mention the impact that products have on our cooking and eating habits. So all of this is to say that the classification systems do not only consider the technical process, but a range of different factors. The NOVA classification system is the one that's most widely used and well known. It's based on the extent and the purpose of food processing, and it categorizes only industrially processed foods, so the foods that we buy in our shops. And it categorizes those foods into 4 different groups. And each group has quite a lengthy definition and list of foods given as examples as part of each group. But today I've put together this example to illustrate how the NOVA classification would categorize different potato products. So if we look at the first group, they're called unprocessed or minimally processed foods. They're described as natural foods or whole foods. They may be treated with certain processes which are considered minimal processes, which are designed to preserve the natural food. Another important point is that no ingredients like fat, sugar, or salt are added to these foods. So if we think of a potato, this could be a whole potato from the ground. It may be treated with processes like washing or slicing. And if it's cooked, no ingredient like fat or salt would be added. Then the second group is called processed culinary ingredients. These include fats, oils, salt, sugar. These ingredients are grouped together because of their intended function. They are intended to be used in preparation and cooking of the group 1 foods, unprocessed, minimally processed foods. And that leads us to group 3, processed products. They are essentially group 1 and group 2 combined. So if we think of a potato, that would be the potato now with added oil and salt, for example. Processed food products may also be treated with other processes used for preservation, like canning and bottling. And they may contain certain additives if those additives are used for preserving the natural food. Then the fourth group are called ultra-processed foods. This is a new term that has been coined by the NOVA classification system, and it's attracted a lot of attention in recent years. They are described as formulations of extracted ingredients, and they contain little or no whole food. They also contain several industrial ingredients or so-called cosmetic additives. These are additives used for the purpose of flavoring or coloring or making the food look more attractive. So an ultra-processed potato product could be a potato chip made up of extracted ingredients like potato starch, flours, and processed with additives like flavorings. Ultra-processed foods may be identified through their ingredients. So some foods like frozen French fries, if they contain certain additives, they may be classified as ultra-processed. Also, the definitions do vary and sometimes mention other aspects. For example, how these foods are formulated may encourage overconsumption. There's a lot of conflicting views among scientists about these food classification systems, and this comes from different views on food processing and nutrition. Definitions are not always clear or consistent, and some terms like whole food are not clearly defined. There are also some other irregularities. For example, whole grain foods are not clearly distinguished in the categorization. For example, white rice and whole grain rice would both be classified in the group 1. The way that food processing levels are categorized are also different to how food science and technologists would view food processing. For example, they would consider adding ingredients like fat, sugar, and salt as part of the recipe and not the process. Also, the additives that we find in food products are regulated and undergo a thorough food safety assessment. In terms of nutritional content, these classification systems do not measure the nutrients in the food. So the foods in each category do vary. There's also some concern that this focus on food processing may mislead people into thinking that home cooking and naturalness automatically means that the food is healthier, when this is not necessarily the case. So I think we can conclude from this that food processing is a complex topic. It's not food processing that's bad per se. There's many complex risks and benefits in terms of food safety, nutrition, food sustainability, and this varies depending on the process and the food. But regardless of the ongoing debates on food processing, the existing advice applies. We should all try to eat more fruits and vegetables, pulses and whole grains. And here, processed food options can help. For example, frozen or canned options, especially in these times of lockdown. But products do vary, so use the nutritional label as a guidance. And thanks, I'm looking forward to your questions later.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Christina. Also sharp on time. Mathilde, can I please ask you to share your screen and share your thoughts with us?
Good afternoon, everybody. So I share my screen here. hope everybody sees the presentation. So I'm happy today to present you a state of the art of the epidemiological literature regarding the relationship between ultra-processed or ultra-formulated foods and the health. And so I'm Mathilde Touvier, I'm the head of the nutritional epidemiology research team in Paris. So food processing has permitted huge progresses across the last century, with many advantages because they allow us to have access to practical foods, quick and easy to prepare, which are safe from a microbiological point of view also. But the question today is, have we gone too far? And have gone too far in terms of processing and formulation. So these questions raised coming from the fact that ultra-processed food share several characteristics that may let the scientists think that may have adverse effect on health. So they're poorer nutritional quality in average, their content in food additives. So currently there is poor knowledge regarding the impact of food additives on human health, but there has been some experimental studies in vitro and in vivo those last years that pointed maybe some risk for some specific additives. So this should be definitely investigated with more research. They also contain other ingredients such as industrial trans fat, for which adverse health effects have been pointed in epidemiological and experimental literature. They also may contain some contaminants coming from the food packagings. Also potentially some contaminants coming that are formed during the processes, and some which are specific to ultra-processed food. And also there is a question regarding the modification of the food matrix and its impact on satiety, bioavailability, transit speed, and so on. So all these questions raised the scientific community to conduct some studies to evaluate the impact of these ultra-processed food on health. And so to do so, sorry, I'm trying to go to the next slide. Yeah. I won't go through this classification because Christina already presented it very well. The most used for the moment, most used classification was the NOVA classification. And this is this classification that has been used in many epidemiological studies that I will present today. And so here is just a slide that I borrowed to Professor Carlos Monteiro at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, who proposed initially this NOVA classification, and which shows the difference between the NOVA 1 product, minimally or unprocessed, and its ultra-processed product of comparison. And so here, for instance, you see a banana, which is NOVA 1, and the product, which is ultra-processed, which tastes less like a banana, but with no banana in it. And so one important point here is that industrial food does not mean ultra-processed food. There are many industrial foods that are processed, but not ultra-processed. And so here you can see, for instance, the difference between a processed vegetable soup here and versus an ultra-processed vegetable soup. So you see here in the ingredient list that we are not really at all on the same product. Regarding the epidemiological studies which evaluated the proportion of ultra-processed food in the diets, you can see here huge variations regarding across the countries, with the United States with nearly 60% of ultra-processed food in terms of contribution to the daily energy intake. And so lower figures for Latin America here, and in France, for instance, we are about 30 to 35% of energy intake brought by ultra-processed foods. Regarding epidemiological data, here is to show you that this science is very, very recent, and until very recently, until the last 2-3 years, we only had what we call cross-sectional studies, so comparing people who had this or this disease compared to healthy subjects, and we compared their diet. And so these studies are useful to provide us with insights and to to generate ideas and hypotheses, but in terms of causality, they are very limited. And so what we would like to have is more prospective studies. And so until 2018, there were only 3 prospective studies that had been conducted regarding the link between ultra-processed food and health on lipid profiles, overweight and obesity, and hypertension. And the 3 studies suggested higher risks for these diseases associated with ultra-processed intake. And so in this context, we wanted to study the associations between ultra-processed food and chronic disease risk. And so within the Nutrinet Santé cohort, we conducted several works. This cohort has been launched in France in 2009. It is the first web-based cohort of this size and worldwide. It also already involves more than 170,000 adult participants, and the recruitment is still ongoing. And it is characterized by a very detailed assessment of dietary exposures and emerging nutritional behaviors. We also had a biobank for a subsample of the cohort. And of course, we monitor regularly the appearance of chronic diseases, and with more than several thousands of cases of several chronic diseases. So this is just the interface, and participants connect to the website of the Nutrinet Santé cohort and can enter all the foods consumed and also the brands of the food consumed. And so we have access to the detailed composition of the products. So I won't go through the details of a statistical analysis here because it's not very interesting, but the interesting point here is that, of course, we classified all the foods consumed by the participants in terms of NOVA categories, and we calculated for each participant the proportion of ultra-processed food in the diet. And when we mean proportion here is in terms of quantity of ultra-processed food and of food consumed per day. And the other important point is that in all these studies, the one conducted in Nutrinet and the other ones in the world, all the socio-demographic, lifestyle, and so on parameters have been taken into account in the statistical analysis, of course. So what we observed are several relationships between the proportion of ultra-processed food in the diet and an increased risk of several chronic conditions. So here, the first study in Nutrinet was about cancer risk, and we observed that for an about 10% increase in the proportion of the ultra-processed food in the diet, it was associated with a nearly 12% increase in the risk of cancer overall, and more specifically here in this study, breast cancer. We also observed association with an increased risk associated with ultra-processed food intake with cardiovascular diseases as a whole, and more specifically coronary heart diseases and cerebrovascular diseases. We also observed a positive association between the proportion of ultra-processed food in the diet and an increased risk of mortality that was very consistent here again across all the sensitivity analyses and the models tested. We also observed an association with an increased risk of depressive symptoms in this longitudinal prospective cohort study. And we also observed a linear association with an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. You can see here the linear association in this curve, an increased risk of type 2 diabetes associated with increased proportion of ultra-processed food in the diet. We also observed different weight trajectories, and so you can see here the participants who had the highest proportion of ultra-processed food in their diet had the highest weight gain during follow-up, and so also the higher risk of becoming overweight or obese across this longitudinal study. We also observed, but here it's a cross-sectional study, an association between ultra-processed food intake in this cohort and an increased risk of gastrointestinal disorders, and notably inflammatory bowel syndrome. So what is interesting here, we conducted a wide range of sensitivity analyses that were all very consistent across the different models. But an interesting point is that even in this model, when we took into consideration the poor nutritional quality of the diet in participants who consume more ultra-processed food. Even when this was taken into account and removed, we still had the association that was significant. And so this makes us think that there are many other components of ultra-processed food beyond only the nutritional aspect that may play a role in these associations. So this is only the recap of all these the cohort studies, the studies conducted in Nutrinet Santé with ultra-processed food and health. And so when we look at other cohorts in the world, there we had the first 3 ones that are already presented. And in the last, let's say 2 years, we have many other cohorts all around the world, in Spain, the US, also in Brazil and the other countries that showed consistent associations between increased ultra-processed food intake and several health outcomes such as frailty, depression, mortality, asthma, overweight, obesity, BMI change, mortality, perturbation of blood lipids, and abdominal obesity here. So we also start to have meta-analysis of all this epidemiological literature showing a consistent result regarding the association between ultra-processed food and here mortality, cardiovascular disease, and cerebrovascular disease in the first one, several health outcomes in the second one here, and another meta-analysis specific to overweight and obesity in the last point. We also have several randomized control trials. So of course we cannot conduct long-term trials on very hard endpoints. When we use people in an experimental context, so we can give them during years ultra-processed food and compare to a control group. It's not ethically feasible, but we can set up very short-term randomized control trials, such as the one by Kevin Hall, already cited by Milka at the beginning of the presentation, and also which showed impact of these ultra-processed food on caloric intake and weight gain. So the mechanism we've already seen, that we had hypothesis. We need really to confirm that the relative share of food additives, contact materials, new farm contaminants, nutritional quality, and modification of the food matrix. And so what we need to retain as a conclusion is that we have an accumulating literature in terms of epidemiology with more than 20 prospective studies showing association between ultra-processed food and adverse health outcomes. These already conducted public health policies to be modified. We had in France, for instance, a parliamentary inquiry commission on industrial food and its impact on health, and several countries modified their official recommendations to include a message to try to favor minimally and poorly processed food and to try to limit ultra-processed food in the diet. This is the case in France, in Brazil, for instance. We also had, as a research perspective, to continue building the evidence with several other cohorts and prospective studies worldwide, short-term RCT also, randomized control trials, and also to investigate the mechanisms behind all this relationship to bring arguments in favor of the causality of the observed associations. And so this is really, we have a huge research program here in the lab at IREN, trying to depict the different mechanisms with food additives. We have a European project funded on the food additives, cocktails of food additives and health, other ingredients, trans fat, maltodextrin, inverted sugars, and so on. We also try to work on the different processes and the contaminants formed during the processes and their impact on chronic diseases. And also we work on the food, the habits, the cooking habits of the participants, and their link with the food packagings they use and the contaminants that this could bring to their diet. And so, to conclude, for the consumer here, while waiting for additional evidence from ongoing research on the impact of food processing and health, when we choose products, we really first need to choose products of better nutritional quality. And so when we talk about nutritional quality, we talk about low level of sugar, salt, a high level of dietary fibers, for instance. So these are the elements for which we have the highest level of proof regarding their impact on health. And so here, for instance, the Nutri-Score, which is already in several European countries, can help with that. But it's the first and the main dimensions. We can see here that it is related to the ultra-processed dimension. You have here in Nova4 products, so ultra-processed, you have here nearly 80% that are Nutri-Score C, D, or E, so there is a correlation. But we really have to keep in mind that this processing dimension is another dimension from the nutritional dimension. It's another point. And so once we have chosen foods of better nutritional quality, we should prefer those also which are minimally processed or unprocessed and with a limit content in food additives. And also, if possible, prefer organic products, so with low residue of pesticides, which is another dimension. So yes, diet is complex. And so there are these at least 3 dimensions that should be taken into account when a consumer should choose a product. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mathilde. A lot of exciting data coming from your overview. Kees, can I please ask you to share your thoughts now and your screen?
It should work now.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to focus more on the psychobiology of the effect of ultra-processed foods consumption on energy intake. Well, from the recent talk of Mathilde, it's very clear that observational studies show that consumption of ultra-processed foods is associated with obesity and obesity-related chronic diseases. But I guess with respect to food processing, you have to realize, and Christina already referred to that, and Milka also, and there are hundreds of different ways of food processing. So it's difficult to give the blame to food processing per se, because you can process foods in so many different ways. And I think also there's no evidence on the potential mechanisms presented. Why would ultra-processed food consumption lead to overweight and obesity? And I will show you some data that give a hint. First, I would like to focus more on the single randomized clinical trial on ultra-processed food consumption and energy intake, and that's the one that also Mathilde referred to. That's the trial of Kevin Hall, which was a 2 weeks inpatient trial within subjects. So one group first had the ultra-processed diet and then the unprocessed diet, and the other group the other way around. So these 20 subjects, they were in metabolic wards, and they received either unprocessed diet or ultra-processed diets for 14 days. And I think what is crucial in this whole study is that the diets, they were matched for available calories, for fat, for sugar, for fiber, and for macronutrients. So the available amount of fat, sugar, calories, for energy was equivalent between the ultra food condition and the unprocessed food condition. And I think this is important to remember. What you see here is the outcome of the study. I think Mathilde also shared this slide. What is the outcome was rather dramatic in the sense that in the ultra-processed food condition, consumers, they consume more than 500 kilocalories more compared to the unprocessed condition. And as a result, they also gained weight in the ultra-processed condition, and they lost weight in the unprocessed condition. Now, you could ask yourself, what is causing this difference? It's not the amount of sugar or the amount of fat that is available in the diet, or the amount of fiber, because they were matched. Sometimes people use the argument that ultra-processed foods are hyper-palatable, and they do not give rise to satiety. Here you see the energy intake across the 14 days, and you see that it's pretty constant. And the difference is also constant. Here you see that the excess energy intake is present in breakfast, lunch, and dinner, not so much in snacks. What you see here, left bottom, you see that the satiety value, the fullness, and the satisfaction obtained from these diets was more or less equal. But of course, in the ultra-processed condition, people consumed 500 kilocalories more to achieve the same fullness as in the unprocessed condition. What is striking here is that the pleasantness of both diets were also the same. So it's not true per se that ultra-processed foods are more pleasant tasting than unprocessed foods. But when you look at the bottom here, the right bottom, then I think you see a clue as to why ultra-processed food diets, they lead to a higher intake. First, their eating rate is faster, and especially their energy intake rate is faster. The energy intake rate in the ultra-processed condition was about 47 kilocalories per minute, whereas in the unprocessed condition it was about 30 kilocalories per minute. So that's a difference of more than 50%. So I think that gives a clue why ultra-processed foods, they lead to a higher energy intake. And that observation relates to a very big field on appetite regulation and the regulation of energy intake and food intake, which is has been a very big field for the last 20, 30 years. And one of the key persons in that field is Barbara Rolls. Now, still not retired, but over 65, I think, but still alive and kicking, doing important research. And this slide is from her from some time ago, and in both slides you see about 1600 kilocalories. This is high energy dense foods that you can eat quickly. I would estimate that most of you would consume this in 10-15 minutes. And here you have low energy density foods on which you need to chew a lot. And Barbara Rolls also looked at the discussion on ultra-processed foods, and she came up, I think, with a very plausible model mechanism through which ultra-processed foods lead to a higher energy intake, and that is one through the notion that ultra-processed foods have a higher eating rate, so they consumed on average, they are consumed faster, and ultra-processed foods also have on average, they have a higher energy density. And I think these two things, they lead to a higher intake, and in the end that leads to weight gain. And I think it's good to realize that for both aspects, energy density and eating rate, in the field of appetite research or regulation of energy intake, there's, for both factors, there's a huge amount of evidence. And recall that in the Kevin Hall trial, the palatability of the foods were the same. So what you see here is a very old study on energy density, where this is from Lauren Lisner and Dave Levitsky, already more than 30 years ago, which they show that diets with a higher contribution of fat to the energy intake, they lead to higher energy intakes, also across 14 days, and they also lead to higher body weights. And after this, dozens and dozens of studies have shown this over and over again, that higher energy densities, they lead to higher energy intakes. Similarly, what we have shown in Wageningen, and which has also been shown in Singapore with the lab of Kieran Ford many times, is that the slower you eat a particular food, and the harder a food gets, then the lower the energy intake. And this is just a regular example of a simple bread, now here with a crust compared to a soft bread. And what you see, that the intake of the hamburger with a soft bread is much lower compared to the hamburger with the crusty bread. And this crust bread, people take smaller chews, they chew for longer, and they have a lower actual intake. And that's a very clear mechanism. On that dimension, I have, on that concept of eating rate. I have a nice movie and I hope it runs well. This movie is about 2 minutes. We'll see that. Yeah, this is individual experiment of one guy consuming 2 kilograms of grapes, one in the form of grapes and one in the form of grape juice. And yeah, I think you could look at the difference and the vast difference in yeah, what happens. And of course, the amount of sugar, the amount of fiber, the amount of vitamins, and that's the same for the grape juice compared to the grapes. And you see he's quite happy. In 1.5 minutes, he drinks 1 liter of grape juice, but that's apparently not the case for the grapes, because he has to work much and much harder. You could try this for yourself with apples or with pears or with oranges or with any fruit. So this takes about 10 times as long as the grapes compared to the grape juice. And of course, what you saw is that he had a big trouble on consuming the grapes compared to the grape juice. What we did together with Karen Ford from Singapore is that we, in the last couple of years, in a number of labs in Switzerland, in the Netherlands, the UK, Singapore, yeah, we measured the eating rate of a large number of foods, more than 300. And then we classify them according to their yeah, processing condition. And what you see here is that and the foods, the ultra-processed foods, on average, they were consumed with a rate of 77 kilocalories per minute, whereas the unprocessed foods were consumed at a rate of 38 kilocalories per minute. But when you look at the actual range of eating rates of kilocalorie per minute, you see that the unprocessed or the ultra processed and the processed condition, they have more or less similar ranges. So also within the unprocessed condition, like for instance, freshly squeezed orange juice, you consume that also at a very high rate comparable to orange juice from a factory. So we think it's not the, yeah. And here you see some foods in the Netherlands which have the highest intake rates. So for liquids, full fat chocolate milk, you can consume that around 420 kilocalories per minute. Apple juice, also 300 kilocalories per minute. And when you look at solids which are consumed at a very high rate, you can think of a sausage roll or a meatball or a yellow cake, which are consumed at a rate of about 150 to 100 kilocalories per minute. So if you consume that for, I would say, 15, 20 minutes, you have already consumed the energy that is necessary for a day. So to summarize, I think there's a clear relationship between processed food consumption and obesity. I think it's not caused by processing per se, but probably through differences in energy intake rate. And I think the mechanism behind that is that there's a lack of oral sensory stimulation with soft, fast consumed energy density food. So I think there's a strong need for a strong experimental study that separates processing from energy intake rate, and we currently carrying out such a study. And we also need to develop tools to improve the satiating efficiency of foods, calories, without giving up on the reward value. And I think it's good to remember that people enjoy foods. It makes them happy, and we should keep that in that way. But we should help people to eat less, and I think you can do that with the help of smart food design. And with this, and maybe for you, for consumers, I would say avoid liquid calories. You ingest them much too fast, and they don't give satiation. And I would say slow down, take small bites, and choose foods to chew on, and eat less and enjoy more. And I think from other fields, like the psychology fields, it's very clear that if you eat with attention, then you eat less and you enjoy it more than when you eat with distraction. So I think there's very clear rules about what to do. And it's an exciting field ahead of us to create an attractive food supply that is not so obesogenic. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kees. I especially like the eat less, enjoy more message. On that note, Andrea, can I please ask you to share your screen and your presentation with us?
Yes, Milka, indeed. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. Good afternoon, Milka. Thanks for the invitation. It has been a great pleasure to listen to the previous speakers, all three of them. I have to really align myself with a lot of thoughts they mentioned, and I really think that there is a lot of still to debate, but it's a wonderful opportunity. From the angle that I'm going to try to give a talk on the processed foods and the way consumers, and me being one of them and my family being one of them, actually should see the processed foods either as friends or foes, requires, I think, a multilateral, very holistic approach. Otherwise, we are going to have only one side of the story, while this story is everything but single-sided. And this word map, this word cloud, actually tries to show that. What do I mean by this? For every word that is present here, and those are the words that basically people have been putting when they think of the ultra-processed foods also for this particular event, you can find good and bad sides of that. You can attribute to food good and bad aspects. You can talk about the obesity from different angles. None of them is definitely good. You can talk about food industry, the way the mantra has been there forever that calorie is a calorie, but also food industry that is highly innovative, that also takes the responsibility. We can talk about the consumer that is cautious, careful, interested in its own his own health, the health of the family and friends, but also the consumer that demands certain changes in the food chain. Changes in the food production, changes in the time interference, and the money that they are able or willing to pay for the food. We can talk about the safety of the food. We can also talk about the spoilage and the food waste. We can talk about the packaging, the life cycle assessments, and so many different aspects that can be seen from good and bad angles, depending on what is good and what is bad. Now, a lot of things have been said, and we are really thinking a lot, and myself, both professionally and personally, think really a lot about this processing and the way the food comes to my table. But before I started to be very critical about it, which I will try also to be during this presentation, was actually to think what were all those good reasons that the food processing actually came into the picture. Well, among those, preservation of food, to reduce the spoilage, to keep the food longer, to carry it for the times when the food is not abundantly present, to increase the safety, both on the microbial and chemical part, to make sure that what we eat is safe, otherwise the non-safe food is not to be considered food at all. To reduce the food waste in terms of a really large proportion of food produced that never actually gets eaten, but becomes thrown away either during processing or during household storage. to modify the flavor and the texture and the aroma and the color and the form of food to something which is palatable and eatable and appealing to the consumer. Try to convince kids to eat broccoli. It will take you probably 20 times of servings before they start sort of liking it. Try to give them an ice cream. It will be 1 or 2 times they eat and they will start liking it. So you have to do something with the broccoli to make it likable. That's my point. Align with the rest of the requirements of a modern life. Otherwise, every change that we want to implement is simply going to fail because people simply won't see it either convenient or not doable at all. When we start thinking about the good processing, the reasons for the processing, it was also part of the business model. For the food industry, for even the competent authorities, I would say, all the assigned industry like laboratory analysis and diagnostic and the pharma and so on. So every change that has to happen needs to take that into account as well. Otherwise, there will be a rather conflicting situation. Also, the food processing as such in general, without putting a label at this stage, what is ultra, what is processing, what is raw, what is minimally processed, results in an opportunity for innovation and creation and employment. We all know that the food industry, at least in Europe, employs something like 4.7, almost 5 million people with turnovers of 1.2 and even more trillion euros. So this has to come from somewhere. So the idea that you can modify the food and that you can create a new process, and by this new process bring something back to the society, also turns society into engaged, employed personnel. And I think this is also very important to keep in mind. When we talk about food processing, we can look at the NOVA. I will reflect on that very briefly because it has been discussed thoroughly until now. We can talk about more classical thermal processing, like pasteurization and cooking that were mentioned, but also the sterilization. And I haven't seen sterilization yet being really like a very clear method that is not really ultra processing in terms of putting additives. And why did we come up, or why did people come up with the thermal processing? Well, in the first phase, to stabilize the food product in terms of inactivating pathogenic microorganisms, destruction of microbial toxins, and elimination of spoilage microorganisms that are going to result sooner rather than later in non-treated food in the food spoilage. Also, we know now, it has been known for many years empirically, but also scientific evidence is there as well, that the thermal processing increases the bioavailability of certain nutrients, removes or degrades certain anti-nutritional factors, basically has certain positive impact in the way the food becomes valuable food for our body. Then the packaging is also sort of food processing, right? Help us avoid the post-contamination of the ready-to-eat or ready-to-heat meal, inhibits the further growth of present microbial flora, modifies, limits the rate of chemical changes as well, and so many other things. Freezing, we inhibit or limit the growth of microbes, we prohibit the changes on the enzymatic level, we reduce the chemical spoilage, and so on. But also we create new methods. Think of the high hydrostatic pressure, intense light pulses of the UVC light, cold plasma, and so on. So a lot of research and a lot of novelty comes from the need to process the foods. So then the definition is, what is the processed food that we are really concerned of, right? NOVA has made this classification, right, into the first category that is most of the time seen as green because it talks about raw materials. And then yellow, orange, and red ones as we go towards the category number 4. But this processing sensu stricto has sometimes a good impact, right? The impact that I think needs to be taken into account when you are balancing the cohorts, the epidemiological studies that provide sometimes razor-thin evidence on a rather thorny question, sometimes very compelling evidence, but it also makes a reasoning, why do we need to take things from two sides? If, for example, we take an example on how the milling of cereals is going to impact omnipresent problem of mycotoxins, a problem which is being potentiated by the current climate change, we see that what we have in the cleaned wheat, and as we move through breaking the grains, sieving, reducing them, sieving, creating the flour of the first, second, and third reduction, we see that from 100%, whatever the initial amount was, of the mycotoxins on a whole initial grain after cleaning and removing the dust and soilness, we reach only 2 to 3% maybe in the final product. And still we are going to make bread out of it, make pastry out of it, make pasta out of it, and so on. So the processing is going to take something away for which we clearly know is cancerogenic, it's toxicogenic, it's cytotoxic, you name it. When we talk about heat treatment, I want to come back to this example of potato that what Christina mentioned in her slides. It's an amazing staple product. We eat it all throughout the world, somewhere more, somewhere less. What we eat a lot in Europe is a French fries. And what happens when you use potato to make a French fries, depending on the conditions, you result in acrylamide production. If we don't apply, and if you assume that we are going to continue eating French fries, right? If you don't do something with the potato, you're going to have too much of acrylamide. So by combining blanching prior to frying, you're going to extract the reducing sugars. This is going to result in the reduced acrylamide production. So by combining the blanching time and the blanching temperature, we see here in the middle of this left graph that we have found a place where the acrylamide was least produced, so was the exposure to this acrylamide from the French fries consumption. If you further combine that with the impact of time and temperature during frying, we can really minimize acrylamide that we are going to put into our body. So this is the case. Now, coming back to what has been mentioned, like organic foods and different kinds of things, there is also a downside of thinking that the vegetables are good things in general. You try to eat, for example, chips from the red beet, the amount of acrylamide, because of the very high amount of reducing sugars, is going to be immense. And this is, of course, where these convenience chips-like foods are indeed dangerous. So one processed thing is not another processed thing, regardless of the fact that the processing is maybe exactly the same. It's all about the content as well, not about the method and technique. Of course, one of the things in the modern world is we want to run away from the dense calorie intake. We want to use fat-reduced products so that we at least put maybe some lower amount of fat, certainly dangerous fats into our body, like saturated ones. On the left-hand side of the slide, we see a regular butter with about 80% of fat and 737 kilocalories. It's an emulsion where the water droplets are trapped into crystalline milk fat, which is mainly saturated. With the stabilization by emulsifier and gelling, we get a product that we can easily spread, for example, on our bread or use it for different purposes. When it's on the room temperature, a little bit less convenient when it's solidified in the refrigerator. But it's a lot of fat. It's a lot of calories. We are concerned about it. So we ask the food industry, well, can you come up with something healthier? And that healthier is, for example, 35% fat-containing low-fat spread, which has double of the less of the calories than the original butter. Okay, so we still need to add the emulsifiers, no problem, otherwise it won't be there as well. But what we also need to add, because of the increased water activity, are the additives to make sure that the preserved food product is still safe and not going spoiled or not going carrying pathogens. So There are good reasons to add stuff, like organic acids to lower the pH and also to work as an antimicrobial agent. Food preservatives and antioxidants to inhibit microbial and chemical and enzymatic spoilage. Texturizers, fortifiers to add things to restore or raise the nutrient levels in the foods. If you don't do that, I mean, a lot of people on different parts of the world just won't have enough vitamin D or vitamin C or some other things which they need to have. So there are things that are sensibly to be added. If we don't add, we are going to have very fast growth of pathogens, like we see on the left-hand side, where we reach dangerous numbers in 35 hours, or we can extend it by adding, in this case, simple salt to almost 60 hours. So the processing and additions of things are meaningful sometimes if we know why we are doing that. To conclude, few messages. Food processing and responsible food additions ain't the same as stuffing food with different sugars. For that matter, I also don't think, and I can argue the case, that going for a lot of fruits and a lot of fructose is equally dangerous. I think we can come up to the biochemical reasoning behind it. No processing and no some of the smart additives won't work for today's food choices and our way of living. So this is what we need to holistically approach. For every change we want to make, we need to look at the risk-benefit assessment. If we reduce something, we are going to open some of the Pandora boxes, and the other way around. What Case was saying, time to put the calories inside of our body is of an amazing importance. But the more time we want to chew, the more time we need to put into preparing food as well. And the time is of essence to the modern person. No time to prepare, and also the money at stake is much higher. Definitely, you will spend more money if you want to cook everything yourself from the raw ingredients. So consumer definitely needs some things. Clear information on good and bad sides, on the risks and benefits. Policy, which is both protective and based on the scientific evidence, but not conservative, to stop development. Needs a respect for food, health, and environment, which is a nexus where we also face issues of food waste that goes in so many different directions, including the climate change, hunger, obesity, and so on. And a holistic thought of a lifestyle. The dose that we put inside, the gradients that we create, the sport that we do, the sleep that we have, the stress that we make, and so on. So all together is needed, right? This is important aspect. So that's my professional opinion. But on my private opinion, what I do, I avoid energy dense, high in salt, sugar, saturated fats, low in micronutrients, and so on. And my choice is to go for minimally processed, clean label, once meal a day approach, sportive lifestyle of running on my fasting moments, half marathons, and freedom to eat healthy, which in my opinion is not the same as eating ad libitum. But that's a choice that I can make, and you can only advise it when you're in your fair conscience can believe that other people can do it as well, because it requires time, it requires means. So this is where I would like to thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thanks for both professional and private views on food and life. Thank you to all four of you for your fantastic talks. And also thanks to the audience for the buzzing question and answers discussion tab in this Zoom setting. It goes to show that the discussion is heated for a reason. I'm afraid that we are a little bit over time. I would still like to invite you to stay for the questions and answers session. I have made an executive decision to extend it by a few minutes. So I would like to now invite the speakers to turn on their cameras. And let's open the questions and answers session. My life has been made easier by the Zoom's option to upvote questions. So then the first one goes to Mathilde, and it comes from Jonas Lazaro Moisa, and it goes, some find the NOVA classification very subjective with little scientific background. Why should we use this classification instead of other more robust existing ones? And why should we rely on this classification for the epidemiological studies, e.g. how micronutrients are accounted for? Matilda, can you share your thoughts on that one?
Yes, thank you for this question, and also for all the very interesting questions that I see in the chat. I'm not sure we are going to answer all, but really it's very interesting. So yes, as Christina presented, there are several classifications. Overall, they are quite consistent in several aspects, and they also have some differences. Currently, the advantage of the NOVA classification is that it is quite simple and also simple to understand for the consumers, and it makes us able in epidemiological studies to distinguish between, let's say, the really minimally unprocessed food and the very ultra processed food. So with several processes of transformation, hard transformation, and also addition of cosmetic additives and so on. And so it allowed us to raise the question and to start epidemiological work based on this classification. And it was really interesting because before that, in the years before, we only relied on studies on really nutritional aspects. So this is another dimension, and so it was interesting for that. And now what we need to do is really to understand all the details of these ultra processed food. I mean, to be able to make things more precise in terms of maybe labeling in the coming years, or also advice to the consumers and modification of the regulation. We really need to understand in these characteristics of these ultra-processed food, which may be food additives, which specific process, which new form compound may be dangerous. And of course, this is a very complex topic, and not all ultra-processed food may have adverse health effect, not all food additives and so on. So now we start with this overall classification, and now we try to understand more in detail all the aspects and their relationship with health in epidemiological studies.
Thank you very much. There are other couple of questions that are pretty related to this one, and they question the NOVA classification itself, the one coming from Nevena Christosova and another one from Professor Kaisa Putanen. I would then go to the one afterwards, and that is from Edouard Casala, whose comments that a lot of people are putting forward that eating organic foods should be privileged over non-organic foods. So what is the scientific proof that organic foods are better? Why would they be nutritionally better than non-organic similar foods? Who would like to take this one? Is that something for you, Andrea?
Well, I don't think so. I think it was Matilda who mentioned the organic foods. Okay. I can give our own research results thereof. None of them actually concerns the nutritional part. I don't think there will be changes, any differences there, in my opinion. But of course, the reduced level of pesticides intakes will for sure happen. But of course, this has to be again balanced with everything else that comes along with it.
Yes, maybe regarding this aspect, the important point here is what I tried to say in the last slide is that really we have several dimensions of the diet. The nutritional dimension is one aspect, and this is the one for which we have the highest level of proof regarding the impact on health. We know currently that if we eat too much salt, sugar, and so on, we will have these diseases. This is proven, and this is on that aspect that the Nutri-Score, for instance, is based. The other dimension regarding food processes, we have these in the recent three last years, these studies showing maybe adverse effects, also very interesting aspects regarding experimental studies as Keith presented and so on. So we have this other dimension. It's not the same one, it's another one. And the dimension regarding pesticide residues, organic food is again another dimension. You can have a product with a very high nutritional quality or poor nutritional quality, which is organic or not, and same with process. So it's really another dimension. And here also, for the moment, the level of evidence regarding the impact of organic food on health is quite low. We have several epidemiological studies, and notably in Nutrinet, we have published, last week, a paper on type 2 diabetes. We had papers on metabolic syndrome, on cancer also in the 2 last years. But for the moment, we need additional evidence. And we also need to estimate the exposure to a pesticide, residue of pesticide in conventional agriculture and organic foods, and to link this to chronic disease risk. And maybe in 2, 5, and 10 years, I don't know, we will be able to say and to answer this question, are really organic food really better for health? For the moment, in France, for instance, public health authorities recommended to prefer organic food in the name of the precautionary principle, but the level of proof needs to be increased.
Maybe to add a little bit on that, I think if
Please
you,
do.
yeah. No, if you say, for instance, like I come in organic shops quite often. Then I also see a lot of, say, organic apple juice, which is produced from, maybe from home. But I think organic apple juice is just as fattening as orange juice from a supermarket. And so, and of course you can press your own oranges and drink it. But the eating rate will, and the obesogenic capacity will be the same, more or less. So there's, and of course there are other issues at stake, but from an obesity perspective, I think it's not much different.
Thank you very much, Kees. Would you maybe like to take the next one, which comes from Walter de Man, who asks, being aware of the confounding factors, I wonder whether the associations would be stronger if you would look at the impact of the nutrient composition rather than the classification as UPF or ultra-processed food. Or in other words, is the ultra-processed food concept adding any new insights to the science?
Yes. As I said, for maybe 10, 20, 30 years now, there have been many epidemiological studies and also mechanistic data showing the association between nutrient profiles, the nutrient content in terms of macronutrient, energy intake, and so on, and chronic disease risk. And this is, we still have things to discover and on other nutrients poorly studied and so on, but still, we have high level of proofs. So this has been already taken into account. Now the novelty here is to take into account the other dimension, which is food processing. And so in our models here, we tried to study the association between the food processing and the level of processing, everything equal in terms of nutrient intake, energy intake, vitamin intake, fruit and vegetable intakes, physical activity, also see those questions. So we adjusted all the models for these characteristics. We also performed stratified analysis, for instance, in people who ate a lot of calorie intake versus moderate calorie intake, people who ate a lot of fruits and vegetables and poor fruits and vegetables and so on. And each time we studied the association between the degree of food processing and chronic disease risk, and these associations remain significant. So we don't say that there is no impact of nutrient content, macronutrient content, and so on health. There is an impact, but in these studies, the interest was to get rid of this impact, to adjust for it or stratify, and to study the remaining impact of food processing on health. I don't know if it answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. I see quite some questions that challenge the ultra-processed food as category or the NOVA classification, coming, for instance, from Dirk Jacobs, from Holly Roper, from Ada Garcia. I was wondering if Andrea, Kees would be willing to share their view on the concept of ultra-processed food and the NOVA classification and its utility in this discussion.
Well, at least it raised, I would say, the concept of ultra-processed foods, it raised a new scientific dimension in the nutrition field beyond nutrients. And I think that's, that's good. But I do think you have to, search for the, I would say, the mechanistic approach. And so what is really causing people to overeat? And then I don't think so much of food additives or added micronutrients, or I think we need to study cause and effect, and also develop policies and help industries to use these insights to come up with better solutions for the obesity epidemic. I think that's the goal, or that's the purpose of nutritionists, food scientists, but also of, I would say, societal groups as food industries. What I'm a bit worried about is that the ultra-processed food discussion in a society is a bit going into the direction of blaming the food industry and going back to romantic times when mothers spent hours to prepare the meals for their children. And of course, that's not going to, we are not going back in time to my mother who prepared a meal for me every day. No, I think the food industry is also part of the solution to this issue, and they can now come up with, yeah, I would say, good solutions, but you need to know the cause and effect of, yeah, I would say, a high overconsumption.
Thank you. And the romanticism of those times is questionable.
Yes, but people have a nice idea about that. Yeah.
Andrea, any thoughts from your side on that question?
Well, just like Kees said, and what I mentioned, it is one of the aspects is really time. This is a time that food industry grants us by providing these products on the market. However, that doesn't mean that we have to eat it all, right? I think our critics on the way the food can be processed, it's right, but we need to go a step further. We need to look what are the alternative processes. What can we do to make this food that we want to have, to keep it healthy, to have it for a long time, to have it safe? How can we process it? And what is the processing so that it can work better for our health? The obesity epidemic is a disaster. The type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, its evil twin, NASH, same. The issue is, what are the alternatives? And are those alternatives working for everybody? Not all of us have the same genetic predispositions. Not all of us need to have the same level of concern. There are racial differences as well in the way we respond to fat intake, to fructose intake. There is also a new scientific evidence relatively new scientific evidence regarding the fructose that I just mentioned that is coming from the fruit, and it's all but just bluntly good, it's not. So I think there is still a lot of science to do, and this is one of the messages to the consumers and to the industry and to the science and the policy makers. We need more money to do research without assuming the answer beforehand.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm really conscious of time at the moment. We have received well above 70 questions. I don't think we stand a chance of answering even 1% of them. So I think we will need to to start wrapping up the discussion here, such an interesting one. We can promise that we will give it a thought and try to find an answer, a creative way of answering these questions. We will either try to do it in writing or in another way. Let's see how creative we can prove to be. I wonder if this discussion has actually helped us. So I would like to offer a few concluding thoughts. And I will use my slides for that. So, are we any closer to clarity? So it could be that we have managed to clarify this consommé of processed food, or it could also be that we have only managed to steam up our kitchen. I still feel, however, that when boiling it down to what people can make sense of, and use of, quite some aligned messages were coming from our speakers, because you all invited us to care and know about what's in the food that we eat, to follow the basic nutrition advice of upping the intake of nutritious foods and to reduce the saturated fat, salt and sugar intake. And while doing so, coming from Kees, not to forget to slow down and enjoy and appreciate, as food is not a mere fuel. Well, obviously, no single discussion can clarify all the issues, and certainly not when intertwined in such a complex matrix of aspects as the processed food is. I still hope that this symposium will leave us all with more food for thought. You see what I did there with all the cooking terminology, and that it will pave the way to a clearer and more aligned communication on the processed food topic. And we as EUFIC will sure follow up further on how to communicate more and better and always based on science. And with that, I would like to thank our speakers once again for the clear and convincing interventions. I would like to thank EUFIC's team for the brilliant organization of the event. And last but not least, I would like to thank you all for your attention. I wish you a successful year closure and a nutritious, healthy, and joyous holiday season. Thank you and goodbye.